What's up everybody? I'm Andrew, founder of 1UP Plus, and I've been making games for about 12 years as an indie dev. And I'm going to show you what I wish I knew then, what I know now. 12 years ago, I had no idea what I was doing. I had no experience, no plan, just a dream to make games. Looking back, some decisions felt impossible, but now they seem obvious. Here's what I learned over the years. This video is going to be most helpful for people planning on creating and shipping a high quality game, and mostly acting solo with some contractor help where necessary. This is what I did. You, hopefully, will be in a similar situation. But if you're just starting out and looking to dip your toe into game making, I show you these experiences from my point of view, how it shaped my journey, and hopefully influences some of your decisions. So let's go over the first steps. Starting out, I had no clue where to begin. I started in 2012. I just quit my job. I had a programming career and I had figured out that I needed to have a break. So where did I start? Well, back then, there's a couple of things I looked at. I started with a game engine. First and foremost, as a programmer, I thought, well, let's pick a game engine. I had some thoughts about what kind of game I wanted to make, but I hadn't thought about how to make it other than, well, let's just get a game engine. So at the time, I had a look at Cocos 2D. It was simple enough. Unity was hanging around there in Unity version 3, but it didn't seem like an obvious choice. It looked more complicated at the time, and there also wasn't too many people recommending what sort of game engines you would pick if you wanted to be an aspiring game engineer. So I picked Cocos 2D, not knowing that there's necessarily anything else. I mean, there was probably, I think there was Construct 2 at the time, but the choice was relatively straightforward. I had a little bit of experience programming in Swift for my previous job for iOS. So I thought, okay, this thing allows me to do the same language just with a bit more of a framework. Now, this is not the best way of necessarily going about it. If I had my time again, I probably would have researched a little bit more on what kind of game I'd want to make first, and even consider, well, is it 2D? Is it 3D? And that would wildly influence which engine we pick. The other part that I hadn't really considered was which platform. Are we making a game for Steam? Are we making a game for web? Are we making a game for Switch, console? How are the gamers going to play this thing? I didn't know much better, so I just literally started with the first thing that I saw. And because I had a little bit of mobile development, that happened to be the platform choice. Nowadays, what would I do? Well, Unity's significantly progressed, and Unreal Engine, and there's Godot, there's a couple of good choices there. Have a look into them all, I would suggest. There's visual scripting available too. So programming is not your only way. And in fact, if you watch some of these other videos, you'll see some of the newer games that I'm producing. I don't write a single line of code anymore. And that's not because I've got an AI agent writing for me. It's actually because I'm using visual scripting, because it's sufficient enough now. You still use the same code logic, but it's just a lot easier to look at. So where did I find my basic art assets? I had an engine set up and I was like, okay, let's get something onto the screen. Well, lo and behold, I didn't know anything about prototyping at the time. So rather than just using boxes and circles and squares, I jumped straight into thinking, okay, I'm going to need some sprites. So there's free assets. You can go to royalty-free image sites. But at the time, I didn't know much better. So go to Google, grab whatever is available, just before prototyping, and see what we can do with it. I might suggest not worrying so much about where you get your assets for originally. You're just there to learn. And since you're not really going to publish this stuff, and it's all just for prototyping and for learning, it's more important that you learn the pipeline. Like, learn how you get your assets into the engine. Placeholders first, get the gameplay up and running, then look into the details and replacing what doesn't look so great, not so hot later. Nowadays, I might suggest that there's some great asset packs out there. You want to try to have standardized assets. I think that helps with things like scale and readability. If you really are stuck and you haven't got a very good internet connection, can't download too much, don't know how you would manage to get the engine, but let's say you are there, then my suggestion would be, just use whatever the in-game engine tools are. But we can go into a lot more detail at a later stage. So again, free packs. Depending on what you're trying to do though, it's possible that nowadays there is 3D as an option. It was just starting to break into the early scene, I guess, around 2011, 2012, Blender was not in the best of states, and Maya and Max seemed incredibly convoluted at the time. I think they're still in the same sort of place, and training was one of the most difficult things. I mean, you still, to this day, the number of free assets that you can get for those platforms is slightly, just amazing compared to today, where there's an enormous amount of great assets for free on the internet. You just have to search through. I would say it's a lot more difficult to make the choice in 3D back then. So, to be honest, it doesn't really matter where you get started because the pipelines are starting to merge somewhat together. My personal choice, go the free option. Blender's a great way to go. Seems to be picking up steam. So the skills would be hopefully transferable even if you needed to. The next thing I'd like to cover is sound. In fact, it's kind of such a big topic. We tend to leave it to last every time I make any sort of project. I think it's important, but when you're starting out, it's probably the least important of all the important things that are going on, especially when just learning how to put together a game loop. All right, so first up, get your engine up, get some basic art assets, figure out your game loop. That's probably the next most helpful thing to do. Then move on to sound. And finally, let's cover animation. I'd suggest moving the transforms around. I wouldn't suggest necessarily what I did. Eventually, I figured out, well, I can't really move these sprites, so I'm going to have to figure out how to make 2D animations in Spine. Eventually, I managed to contract this out. I was very lucky. I managed to get away with a couple of games before I managed to even create 2D animations. And that was just simply by moving the sprite transforms. So if you're clever, you could probably put together a few decent looking animations without having to worry about more complicated animations. So, well, nowadays, and this is something that we can cover in a later video, I am learning 3D animation in Blender. And it's something that's enjoyable. It's amazing what you can produce out of that piece of software. I highly recommend it. If you're like me, especially if you're a programmer, I found learning 3D is a little easier than learning 2D. And I'll explain why. In 2D, I had to learn, pick up a pencil and learn to draw. And effectively, you're rendering out the final composite of. In 3D, you've got geometry, you're then putting textures over that, and then lighting all of that. And in 2D, you're doing all of that in one stroke of a pencil approach. And that's my biased take as a programmer looking to make 3D just looks a lot simpler than 2D. Okay, so let's move on to making that first game loop. Well, how long did it take? Was it frustrating? Yes, and yes. However, the hardest part was actually trying to get the game to function. I didn't have code assistance. Google's search kind of didn't dig that deep into forums where the information was available. There were very few tutorials on YouTube, especially for obscure engines that weren't so ubiquitous like Unity. So Cocos 2D was it was a thing, it was an up and coming engine. So I was able to find a couple of things, but they tended to be buried into blogs and you tended to have to look around. So I did the only thing that I really could do which was focus on what it was that I was trying to achieve. I didn't actually just do a bunch of tutorials. I went function by function. That is after I understood how a game engine works. So that you do still need to do a basic form of a tutorial just to get yourself familiar with an engine and its kind of basic layout. But after that, then I would highly recommend doing it the same approach, which is not necessarily take tutorials. You can do them if you like, but if you're like other people with tutorial help, focus on what each step of the way that you're trying to achieve, and then look up either a tutorial or a guide directly on that one aspect and see if you can break it down into something smaller. So I'll give you an example. I want to take my little guy on the screen and move him around. That in itself can be broken down into, well, what is a little guy on the screen? In Unity, Unreal, that you need a character and a capsule, and then you need some sort of movement script. So you could break down those and then try to understand how your inputs connect up to the movement scripts to move them around relative to the camera. So that's another piece that you would understand. This is probably, in my understanding, the much easier way to piece together the Rubik's Cube of puzzle of game dev, rather than just doing a straight up tutorial where you just create Zelda on the fly, which would be too big of a task anyway. That would then give you an understanding of how the components actually individually work and how they communicate to each other. So, how long did it take? Well, this was where it starts to get really interesting. I think the first type of game that I tried to create a multiplayer turn-based tactics game that was actually a simultaneous turn-based game. Too difficult. If you were not like me and you did it the way that I think I would suggest and the way I would do it, having learnt what it takes, I would have started a lot simpler. Yep, start with Pong. You hear it 1,000 times, but honestly, it was a lot simpler. And surprisingly, and this is what happened to me, after about 6 months, I finally managed to put a demo of the game together. In fact, it wasn't really a demo, it was just a tutorial. And lo and behold, had some people play it, discovered a whole bunch of issues with it, and started again. Basically, rather than starting again on the same game, however, I just started what I should have done, which was start with a single mechanic game. An object avoidance, move something around on the screen, avoid the flying objects, and I managed to ship it. So eventually, I did get back to that original game, but there was only after a number of much smaller, more prototype basic projects that led me there. So let's get to the next section, the hardest decisions. Where do I release my game? itch.io, Steam, mobile? Well, when I started, there weren't that many choices. Steam had a green light system. itch.io existed, but there was this brand new spanking app store thing that was floating around, and Google Play shortly thereafter. So I gave that a shot. Package requirements were a bit of an issue. I think the package size of your game had to be less than 100 megabytes. Mine came out just under that because I didn't know anything about optimizing textures or removing unnecessary bloatware in the engine. Then it became about 200 megabytes and things got a lot easier. This probably won't really matter to the first timers. Where would I go now? itch.io, absolutely. The process is a lot shorter. You won't waste nearly as much time complying with all of the myriad of complexity of requirements and compatibility issues. So itch.io definitely would be my go-to move. And then the next question became, well, I'm working on my game. When's it good enough to launch? And this is the age-old discussion of perfectionism versus just shipping it. I approached it from a marketing standpoint, to be honest. I said, when I start with a concept in my mind, and then I turn that into what screenshots might look like, does my gameplay match my screenshots? Yes? Okay, time to ship it. It's your first project, it's your first prototype, it's your first game jam. This is probably the safest way to avoid scope creep. And I say that with all the well-meaning intentions of I'm trying to help you discover the entire process. So yes, you're going to make a shippable game, but no, we don't need to get caught up in all the nitty-gritty, and that's probably best for future projects where you can experiment and go down all of the rabbit warrens. But the first time round, honestly speaking, get 1 or 2 mechanics up and running, build a few screenshots that make sense to showcase that mechanic, and then ship it to itch. I'll make a whole separate video later. We'll go into this scope creep argument. Right, learning to market. I thought, if I build it, they will come. Nope. Suffice to say, I'm still learning this myself. I started without marketing. I just figured out, I'll just release it. I'll see what happens. To be honest, I wasn't really thinking what might happen. I think I stuck a price tag on it, which looked like other games on the market were around there, and moved on. In this case, in this day and age, probably just go on itch and make it free. There's not really any need to put a price on it, or you could accept donation. You really like to think about costing your game. And then after moving to PC, and this is, mind you, about 5 or 6 years later, we were approached by publishers, and we also approached publishers ourselves, who helped us eventually get in front of streamers. But this is something that we did much further down the track. I'm talking 5 years down the journey. That was probably a mistake, not the best way to get a commercial game made. Definitely what I would do today is different. For the first game, just self-publish. Go ahead, do your own marketing. Try to understand how the social networks work, how to get people to have a look at your game. But to be honest, building your first game, it's mostly a learning experience, and I wouldn't expect to get more than your mum and dad to play it and a couple of friends. But if you've gone beyond that and you've done that, I'll make another video probably a bit later about, well, how you're going to make the next actual commercial game. Well, how are you going to figure out where you're going to get your audience from? So the next section, what I wish I knew. You don't need to know everything. You learn by doing. Start small. finish things. This is why scope is actually your best friend. Tiny, tiny, tiny scopes. So I've heard quite a few people on the internet, some other developers like Jonas Tyrola, if you're interested there, Bite Me Games, Dude. They're all saying nowadays start small, finish things. So I'm probably a parrot now. I would say yes, starting small is definitely a way to go. It's not what I did for the very first game, but I quickly realized I needed to do that because, well, to be honest, 6 months of eating into your runway before you realize, wow, this thing is actually going to take a lot more than the amount of runway I have is probably a good time to make a pivot into smaller games. Then marketing matters more than you need players, not just a game, but the game does need to exist. So work on the game mechanics first, get that up and running, then start thinking about the players. And most likely I would do that on your second project. It's honestly a lot easier to break things down into chunks rather than trying to do it all at once. Looking back, the biggest initial mistake was focusing solely on acquiring the technical skills to make a game, but not putting in time or iterations to design and improve the surface area of the game. To me, it was a mere afterthought. I was like thinking, well, the game mechanics are all that matters. I'll just put those together and that's it. The game's done. So over time, I've started to figure out why marketing is a part and parcel of game development with commercial intent. Thinking must be holistic. It's not just promotion. So here's a word of encouragement. If you're starting now, you have more tools, more resources, and more support than ever. What's next for me? Well, I'm working on 2 projects. One's a cute, cozy little panda. You might have seen some of the videos. And a mini RTS casual game. So let me know in the comments, what was your biggest struggle as an indie dev? And I'll be sure to make another video and see if I can address some of those issues. Thanks a lot, and see you later. If you're interested in more of my content, click one of these. Bye-bye now.